Hey guys, what's going on? It's me, Jay. I'm here to talk about another year in review video. This year we did 1989 last night. Tonight we're doing 1990, the WWF year in review, and I'm going to talk a little bit about WCW as well. Now, 1990. Okay, the song on the top of the charts is Michael Bolton's "How Am I Supposed to Live Without You." The number one movie in the movies is No Holds Barred. No, I'm just kidding. It's Goodfellas, starring Ray Liotta, and the president of the United States is George H.W. Bush, and he's about to embark on the first geopolitical conflict since 1975 in the Persian Gulf, when the Vietnam War ended, in the form of the Persian Gulf War. And the world is on the edge of its seat because, well, we know the history of what happened and how the American people reacted to the Vietnam War. So, but here we are in Stamford, Connecticut, in the World Wrestling Federation, what the world is watching. Well, still watching, but as I said in the last video, 1989 was the height of the 80s boom period that began in 1984. 1989 was the boom. It ushered in major changes in the world of professional wrestling. The first pay-per-view, the first mega boom period in the industry's history since the late 1950s. Really, since Gorgeous George fought Whipper Billy Watson at the Maple Leaf Gardens in Toronto in a hair match. At the end of the 50s, the business kind of, went underground. And it wasn't until 1980, 82, 83, and then, with 84, with the rise of Hulkamania, that the business picked up again. But by the end of the 80s, pay-per-view would come, WrestleMania 3 had happened, 93,000 plus. All this stuff had transpired. The WWF left the NWA for the final time in 1982. Vince McMahon Jr. took over for his father, in 1983, and he decided to go national, first purchasing the Los Angeles, buying up all the territories. Because, like I always explain, prior to that, wrestling had been subdivided into several different territories, all across the country and even the world. As we will see in 1990, the WWF becomes involved in an interpromotional event with New Japan Pro Wrestling and its biggest rival in the country of Japan, All Japan Pro Wrestling, headed by Giant Baba and the late Giant Baba and the late Antonio Inoki, respectively. But that's how wrestling was up until the 1980s. So the 80s was a complete roller coaster ride for the wrestling business. Vince McMahon first purchasing Los Angeles territory, then going on, first initially purchasing his father's territory from Gorilla Monsoon, Arnold Scullin, and Phil Zacco, and of course his dad, and then the four owners of the territory since the early 1970s when Tootsman left the promotion, one of the co-founders, legendary wrestling promoter who many people consider the architect of what modern day professional wrestling is. He crafted the craft in the 20s, moving it forward from basically amateur style wrestling, Greco-Roman and catch wrestling to a more showmanship style, and crafting the idea of kayfabe, the idea of works, the idea of angles. Tootsman did it all, but he had a gambling problem. So Vince McMahon Sr. wanted him out of the business, even though he helped found it. and he never really got along with all the NWA promoters. The NWA, of course, was formed in 1948. And he never really got along with any of those people. So that was part of the reason why Vince McMahon Sr. left the NWA in 1963. But when he was out by the early 70s, Vince McMahon Sr. had patched it up with the NWA and decided to, join the NWA again, so they could do a lot of these dream matches between NWA signed wrestlers that were signed to NWA territories, and wrestlers signed to the Worldwide Wrestling Federation. And that's what they did. In 1981, they did a match between then champion Ric Flair and Bob Backlund. And then, we talked about it in the 70s, in those Citrus Bowl matches. On the other channel I talked about it. Harley Race and Jack Briscoe, and Harley Race and superstar Billy Graham. In those cases. So he believed, Vince McMahon Sr. believed in working with the NWA promoters. But Vince McMahon Jr., his son, did not. So when Vince McMahon Jr., was deciding to take over the company, he was out of the NWA. Famously, it was an NWA conference in the early 80s. I think it was like 82. Where he and Jim Barnett was the booker for the Georgia territory, left the NWA. So both territories that were national promotions by this point, because WOR, the TV station that Vince McMahon Sr. was dealing with out in New York, which was Vince McMahon Sr. and Jr. were dealing with out in New York, which was Channel 11. That had a national feed, and of course, WTBS also had it. So both guys didn't want to be associated or tied to the NWA necessarily. Georgia ended up going back into the fold of the NWA because in 1984, Vince McMahon Jr. tried to buy Georgia and actually was successful in doing so, and then did business with Ted Turner. The ratings were a flop. The Southern fans hated it. They wrote in letters to say, "Where's my Gordon Soley wrestling? Where's my old school wrestling? Where's Mr. Wrestling 2? Where's Ole Anderson? Where's the Briscoes?" Right? All these mainstays that have been mainstays in the Georgia territory were no longer being seen on the Georgia territory, but WWF wrestlers were being seen on the channel. And plus, Vince McMahon promised live studio wrestling, like Georgia Championship Wrestling had been giving the TBS Superstation since 1973, and that's not what he gave him. He gave him, pre-tape matches, the kind of stuff you would see on, say, Primetime Wrestling, which was this USA show that he was doing. All American Wrestling was the initial USA show. And Ted Turner didn't like it. So Ted Turner, what does he do? He comes out and he tells Bill Watts, who was the former booker in Georgia, like in the mid 70s, and now the owner of Mid-South Wrestling, based out of Tulsa, Oklahoma, but Bill Watts kind of moved the base of the promotion when he took over Mid-South in the late 70s to Shreveport, Louisiana. So that was really his base, and New Orleans was his main city. And he was setting the world on fire with the JYD, right? A star that he had gotten from, was initially trained by Bret Hart's father, Stu. So he was doing pretty well. And he had other guys like Butch Reed came in from Florida, other wrestlers. So Bill Watts was doing pretty well. And his booking style, he initially had Ernie Ladd as a booker, the first African-American booker in professional wrestling. And then for a time, he had Buck Robley as his booker. And of course, Bill added his creative geniuses in it too, because he had been in the business for so long. He'd been in the business since the early 60s. Even in 1965, he even worked in the New York territory in the WWF first as Bruno Sammartino's partner, and then as a heel, brought in to feud with Bruno Sammartino. In fact, it was when he worked in the New York territory in Washington, D.C., which was basically, and still is to this day, a chocolate city, they call it, a majority black city in the country, that Bobo Brazil, who was the U.S. champion at that time, because yes, the WWF did use the U.S. champion, once in a while. So Bobo Brazil, who they call the Jackie Robinson of wrestling, was wrestling down there against Bill Watts, and Bill discovered that if you use an African American talent, African American fans will come to see it. So when he got his own promotion, he did the same thing with the Junkyard Dog, and he was setting the world on fire. So Ted Turner wanted his wrestling on TBS as well. So Bill Watts got a show, Vince McMahon had his show, and Ole Anderson, who was the former booker in Georgia before Black Saturday, also. Okay, Lisa. Lisa says tomorrow she wants to do a video on the Olympics. So do my research on it. Bill Watts also, I will, Lisa. Bill Watts, all three got a show. Ole Anderson also got a show. But Vince McMahon's show flopped. So what they decided to do was have Vince McMahon sell his share of Georgia Championship Wrestling to Jim Crockett, who was the promoter of the Mid-Atlantic territory, based out of Charlotte, North Carolina. So Jim Crockett is also a second-generation promoter, just like Vince. He buys the promotion, and then he becomes, of course, the de facto president of the National Wrestling Alliance. So what was Georgia now becomes retied into, 2 years later, into the National Wrestling Alliance. And basically, the show is World Championship Wrestling, which was what Lisa says I should do a video on all the women that came from the WWE. Yeah, Lisa, that would be an interesting video. Or the WWF. Yeah. Okay, we will speak about that. Let's speak for a minute about women, because 1990 is a very important year. Well, we always start off with the year before, right? 1990 is a very important year for women in professional wrestling. It's a pivotal year because at this time, well, let's backtrack a little. You know what I mean? Before we talk about the women of professional wrestling a little bit. So here we have Jim Crockett Promotions. His television show is World Championship Wrestling. This is the name of the show. But the promotion behind the show is the National Wrestling Alliance. So that's a national promotion. And of course, the WWF is another national promotion. So basically, throughout the 1980s, these two promotions are doing battle with each other. They're rivals to each other. And women's wrestling, as Lisa brought up, is a very crucial, important part of it. Because what does Vince McMahon do with that $1 million that Jim Crockett gives him to buy Georgia Championship Wrestling? He starts WrestleMania. But prior to WrestleMania, in 1984, they have a special, the Brawl to End It All. And in this Brawl to End It All, they have Moolah. Moolah has been she became the women's champion in 1957, right? And she remained, I think she beat like Judy Martin, or Mildred Burke, one of the early women's wrestlers from the 1940s and 50s. So she beats her, and she remains the champion for all this time. But it's a new wave in popular culture. It's a new wave in music. It's a new wave in society. And Cyndi Lauper's song in 1984, "Girls Just Want to Have Fun," becomes the number one song on MTV. And who's in the video for "Girls Just Want to Have Fun"? The manager, a famous WWF manager, Captain Lou Albano, is somebody that Dave Wolf, Cyndi Lauper's boyfriend at the time and manager, meets Captain Lou on a plane. Now, Dave Wolf, he grew up in New York. So did Cyndi Lauper. She grew up in Queens. So he grew up in New York, so he's familiar with Captain Lou Albano, because basically in the 60s and 70s, in the New York territory, in the WWF, which was the New York territory at the time, which became the WWF, which is today the WWE. Captain Lou Albano was the main adversary for Bruno Sammartino. Even when Bruno Sammartino lost the championship in 1971 to Ivan Koloff, he held the championship for 9 years. 1972, sorry. 9 years he held the championship. He won it in 63 from Buddy Rogers and lost it in 72 to Ivan Koloff. Well, who was his manager at the time? Captain Lou Albano. So Albano was well known to New York wrestling fans. So Cyndi Lauper, the idea is that Captain Lou Albano will pretend to be sexist, and he will say that women have no place in wrestling. And then Cyndi Lauper will come out and say, "Oh yeah, Captain Lou, well I challenge you to bring out a wrestler, and I bring out a wrestler. I'm using my New York accent, my heavy New York accent, because that's what Cyndi Lauper has, a heavy New York accent. I challenge you, Captain Lou, to bring out one of your wrestlers, and I bring out a wrestler, and we have a match." So he brings out Moolah, right? And like Moolah's like 80 years old, and she brings out Wendy Richter. Wendy Richter, a young lady from Texas. I think for a while, trained by Moolah, because most of these girls was trained by the fabulous Moolah in her training school. I think Wendy Richter was like, she probably started out in Houston, maybe with Paul Bosch or Fritz von Erich's territory, maybe. But anyway, they have this match, and this is the highest rated segment in MTV's history. MTV is a brand new entity, just started in 1981, right? Never before have they done anything on MTV, but it's a huge thing, and it's women's wrestling. So from there, Roddy Piper gets involved, and Roddy Piper, he was in a lot of different territories. He started off he's from Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, in Canada. But I think he I don't know if he was in Gene Canada. That was like Western Canada. That was Stu Hart's territory. He's a cousin of Bret Hart. But Gene Kaninsky was in that territory, the Vancouver territory, British Columbia, that area. But he really gets his start in Don Owens' territory in Portland, Oregon, and that's where he really kicks off. And even as Vince McMahon expanded and Roddy Piper worked for the WWF, he still later on was loyal to Don Owen, and he wouldn't compete. He wouldn't wrestle matches or run against the Portland territory, because he knew it would affect Don Owen's business, and he was loyal to Don Owen. So, and then from there he's in LA. He's one of the biggest stars in LA in that time. Even in the dying days of LA, he was one of the biggest heels. because he does this thing. He did this thing on the bagpipes where he played the bagpipes, and he says, and LA is a huge Mexican population, right? LA is, to this day, LA is like the center of Mexican America, right? So huge Mexican population, Mexican American, Chicano, what have you. And Roddy Piper gets on there and he says, I'm going to play the Mexican national anthem. So he starts playing on the bagpipes and he plays La Cucaracha, right? And the crowd goes crazy. It's one of the riots in Olympic Stadium in LA, where where they have it. You know what I mean? And he's wrestling Chavo Guerrero. Chavo Guerrero, of course, a member of the famous Guerrero family, Eddie Guerrero's uncle. Eddie Guerrero's brother, sorry. Eddie's so young, you sometimes forget that he's in the family, and him and Chavo, I'm talking about Chavo Sr., but him and Chavo Jr., Chavito, were like brothers more than cousin and uncle. But yeah, it was Eddie Guerrero's brother, Chavo Classic, that Roddy Piper is wrestling. So and then he moves down to Jim Crockett Promotions, and this is where he gets noticed nationally. For a while, he's in Georgia as a commentator. That's when they first turned him babyface. After Gordon Soley, the announcer in Georgia, gets beat up, he defends Gordon Soley. But they move him to Jim Crockett Promotions in Charlotte, where he's a manager. And he turns babyface, and he has a dog collar match at Starrcade 83 with Greg Valentine. But he's really served better as a heel. So he comes in as a heel in the WWF in 1984. And he gets involved with the Cyndi Lauper thing because it's Cyndi Lauper is like for representing for women's rights. She's representing for feminism. Right. So she's also representing for rock and roll, because the whole idea is the rock and wrestling connection, the connection of wrestling and rock and roll together. So Roddy Piper plays bagpipe music. So that's not necessarily rock and roll. So he becomes the anti-rock and roll guy against Cyndi Lauper. So the record, Girls Just Want to Have Fun, goes gold. Cyndi Lauper presents the record out there, and now Captain Lou Albano is a babyface. And Roddy Piper cracks the gold record over Captain Lou Albano's face. And this is on MTV. And Mr. T, who was on the A-Team at the time, and also the main protagonist, or the main antagonist, if you will, rather, of the 1982 movie Rocky III, with Hulk Hogan is also in. So he sees this happening. He jumps out of the audience and he protects Captain Lou Albano and his Cyndi Lauper and Dave Wolf. Roddy Piper actually picks Dave Wolf up for an airplane spin and drops him on his head. And then MTV's reporting this like this is fucking real, right? And this leads to the first WrestleMania tag team match where Mr. Wonderful Paul Orndorff and Roddy Piper team up to take on Captain Lou Albano. Team up to take on Hulk Hogan and Mr. T for WrestleMania. And WrestleMania is starts off with a bang. And the women, Wendy Richter and Cyndi Lauper and Fabulous Moolah, they're the catalyst for this. Later on, as Captain Lou turns face, Moolah stays a heel, and at WrestleMania 1, she brings out Leilani Kai, an opponent for the Fabulous Moolah. An opponent for Wendy Richter, managed by Leilani Kai is managed by the Fabulous Moolah, and Wendy Richter is managed by Cyndi Lauper. And Wendy Richter wins, and they do the do-si-do around Madison Square Garden. It's pretty cool. And that's WrestleMania 1. And Vince McMahon used the money from Jim Crockett Promotions to finance WrestleMania 1. And that's the build for WrestleMania 1. We go into WrestleMania 2. Women don't, but see, after that, after 1985, Wendy Richter decides to ask Vince McMahon for more money because she feels like Hulk Hogan and Mr. T, they weren't the only ones that built the card for WrestleMania. She did too, and she wants more money. Vince is not having it. So he decides to take the WWF Women's Championship off of her in a screw job finish. Moolah's dressed up as Spider Lady, and she puts Wendy Richter in a small package and pins her for real. She was supposed to, the script said she was supposed to, she was supposed to kick out, and she didn't. So, and then Wendy Richter's like, what the hell happened? You know what I mean? But she got screwed. That was the first screw job in the history of the WWF where Vince McMahon reversed the decision, basically. So that's 1985. So women are basically, pushed to the side. They have the Jumping Bomb Angels and several Royal Rumbles, the first Royal Rumble. They have a tag team, the Jumping Bomb Angels. And for a while, they have the Women's WWF Tag Team Championships. But by 1989, where we're at, Lisa, women's wrestling is basically no more. I spoke with last night's video about how women, they brought Sherry in from the AWA. Sherry Martel, she was another student of Moolah. She trained under Fabulous Moolah. She's from Alabama, I believe, initially, but she broke in, as one of Moolah's girls. What happened was Fabulous Moolah would travel around, with these troop of girls. The girls, they weren't necessarily signed to one promotion or another. They were like special attractions. So, sometimes some promoters would use them in certain cities for certain things, and other times not so. And Moolah would always get a kickback, half of their cut. A lot of trainers did this back in the day. And if a wrestler became popular, even if it was a certain area, and they weren't working for that particular promoter, the promoter would still want a cut of whatever they earned. Vern Gagne famously did this for the people that he trained under his camp, the owner of the AWA. And Moolah did the same thing. She learned it from Billy Wolf, no relation to Dave Wolf. Billy Wolf was Mildred Burke's husband. Mildred Burke, the first star in professional wrestling in the 1930s and 40s. Because at that time, that's when women's wrestling really started, the 1930s and 40s, because especially the 1940s, because just like the movie A League of Their Own, and women had to step up to the plate and do baseball, wrestling was the same thing, because of World War II. Men weren't around to do anything, so the women did it. The women took care of it, and that there's a good documentary on that, Lipstick and Dynamite, about women in professional wrestling in those days. When they really took center stage, the Mildred Burke days. And unfortunately, you had, just like you had with the men, promoters like this guy Billy Wolf that would take advantage of the wrestlers, sometimes before forcing them to do sexual acts against their will. And Moolah was no different. A woman took over, as the promoter of these women, the trainer of these women, Moolah, and she abused people. She took advantage of people. She forced this African American wrestler, Sweet Georgia Brown, to do all kinds of sexual acts, on the road, to men, and do drugs. It was just crazy stuff. So by that time, by 1990, 90, they phased the women's division out, and Sherry became a manager, famously the manager of the Macho King Randy Savage, who is now a king. So now we're at 1989 now. And in 1988, Jim Crockett Promotions was bought out by Ted Turner, by his television company, because again they were faced a conundrum like they were faced with 4 years before, where Um, he didn't want to get rid of wrestling because wrestling still brought him big ratings, but at the same time, he didn't want to have deal business with Vince McMahon. And besides Jim Crockett, Vince McMahon was the only game left in town because Bill Watts went out of business in '87 due to the oil bust in the southwestern states, Oklahoma, Mississippi, East Texas, where he was stationed. You know what I mean? So, you know, Jim Crockett had no choice but to sell. Some people say if Jim Crockett had just stayed in the Carolinas and Virginia, he'd have been all right in his territory. But he wanted to branch out. He went to Chicago. He did a show in Chicago where he was supposed to put the belt on the Road Warriors, and that was their gimmick hometown. And he freaking, kept the belts on Arn Anderson and Tully Blanchard. It was bullshit. So Jim Crockett sells the promotion to Ted Turner. Now the promotion becomes officially WCW. They're still in the NWA, and they would remain in the NWA for 4 more years doing business with the NWA. It's not till Eric Bischoff takes over and moves the tapings to Disney that they begin to have a problem with the other NWA affiliate promoters, who are basically like low-level indie guys at this point in time. And then finally in 1993, WCW calls it quits with the NWA and they make their own championship. Later on, well, they had to make their own championship before that, but because of something we'll talk about in this video, in this year, something that transpires in this year, that we're going to talk about later on, that WCW had to make their own championship apart from the NWA championship. But from that time on, from 1990 to 1993, the WCW championship and the NWA championship were together. They were like 2 world championships, and a guy could have prestige holding either one. It didn't really matter. Like the NWA championship still held prestige in the minds of WCW fans. Until 1993, and then '94, the Clash Champions, a match with Sting and Flair. They started calling after they left the NWA, they couldn't really call it the NWA Championship anymore, so they started calling it the International title. So Sting is the International Champion, and Ric Flair is the WCW Champion, and they finally merge it, and the big gold belt becomes the true WCW title. But so now in 1988, WCW is owned by Ted Turner, and he brings in Jim Herd. Now, Jim Herd is notoriously bad for a lot of things that we'll talk about in this video pertaining to WCW in 1990. But where did we leave off as far as the WWF in 1989? Because I always like to backtrack and go back a little bit of ways, to talk about the year before. We left off with Zeus and Hulk Hogan. Zeus, Tommy Tiny Lister, a movie actor, a former football player from Compton, California, known more famously for being in the movie 1995's Friday as Debo. Now, the character of Debo, I did a little bit of my research. The character of Debo is based on Big U, a notorious Rolling 60s Crip. That many people that watch Vlad TV will know about who Big U is. He's very influential in the communities, in those urban communities in Southern California, particularly Compton, Watts, and South Central Los Angeles. And the bully character of Debo is based on him. He was actually the manager of Tommy Tiny Lister. So he becomes the main star of Vince McMahon's first movie project, No Holds Barred, which, like I said, is basically Hulk Hogan's version, or like a wrestling version of Rocky, the 80s Rockies, not the 70s Rockies. The Rockies without the sentimentality, more like Rocky 4, than Rockies 1, 2, 1 and 2, and even 3, because 3 has a lot of sentimentality because Mick dies. In 4, he has a robot. He's going to Russia. If you can change, I can change. We all can change. That kind of vibe is going on in No Holds Barred, and that's not really going on in uh, in the 70s versions of Rocky, more so in the 80s. So this has a real 80s action hero vibe. And in the 80s, action heroes were all the rage. Arnold Schwarzenegger was out at the time, Sylvester Stallone, avenging America's loss in Vietnam, and Rambo, and all this kind of stuff. So Hulk Hogan and Vince McMahon wanted to use this as a vehicle to launch Hulk Hogan's movie career. Now, in a Vlad TV interview before he passed away in 2020, Tiny Lister, Zeus, Debo, whatever you want to call him, he said that Vince McMahon was specifically looking for a black wrestler to be the antagonist to Hulk Hogan, both in the movie and on WWF TV, because he said, and this is kind of true in a way, it's a well-known fact, not really talked about by boxing promoters or wrestling promoters or MMA promoters like Dana White and stuff. But when you have different races fighting each other, particularly black and white, because of the historic animosity between those two ethnicities, but even Puerto Rican and Mexican in boxing, for example, is a common one. When you have different ethnicities fighting, let's just say in this case black and white, it sells more than black and white and white. You know what I mean? White and white rarely happens because white fighters just aren't that good. And black and white, and black happens a lot, especially in the heavyweight division, because black people have dominated the heavyweight division since Jack Johnson. A perfect example of that is Jack Johnson when he became the first black heavyweight champion in boxing in 1908. He has his match against James J. Jeffries, what they call at that time the fight of the century, on July 4th, 1910. It's a complete sellout. People are racist at the time. They want to see Jack Johnson get beat by this white guy who they consider to be the true heavyweight champion of the world, because they say, well, the guy that Jack Johnson beat was not the true heavyweight champion of the world. Jack Johnson, the Galveston Giant from Galveston, Texas, is worthless in the ring, and my guy, James Jeffries, can beat him. Of course, he didn't beat him. Jack Johnson remained the champion. An interesting side fact, Jack Johnson was promoted by Vince McMahon's grandfather. The fight he had in Havana, Cuba in 1914. It was 1914 or 1915 against Jess Willard, where he did lose the championship, was promoted by Vince McMahon Sr.'s father, Jess McMahon, who basically, after, the Jack Johnsons of the world and the Jack Dempseys of the world, faded from the scene in heavyweight boxing in the 30s, kind of fell by the wayside, because you had guys like before Joe Louis, you had guys like James Braddock, who Cinderella Man is based on, fighting. And the 30s weren't, the late 20s and early 30s weren't a good time for boxing. So what does Jess McMahon do? He goes into professional wrestling, and it is there in professional wrestling that his family remained. You know what I mean? He starts promoting professional wrestling. At first, he was promoting even before boxing, he was promoting baseball. He was a baseball manager for a Negro League team called the New York Lincoln Giants. So the McMahon roots in sports go way back to like the early 1900s, and they understood the value of ethnic champions, which is why when Vincent Vincent J. McMahon got into the business. He promoted ethnic champions. He promoted at first in the 50s. He promoted Argentina Rocca, and then in the 60s and 70s he promoted Bruno Sammartino and Pedro Morales respectively. And of course he promoted Bobo Brazil and Ernie Ladd and a bunch of other black talents. Never as champions, but he promoted them. But Vince Jr. didn't really do that. What I mean? He was looking for a national champion, so he made All-American Hulk Hogan his guy. But I think it was 1915, I believe, the Jess Willard Jack Johnson fight. Let me look that up, guys. Yeah, it was 1915. But um so he had a different philosophy. His philosophy was All American Hulk Hogan, which, as we'll see in 1991, becomes an even more bigger motif for Hogan as Hogan carries the mantle of America against the evil Iraqi sympathizer Sergeant Slaughter. um, so going back to my original point, yes, it is true. I do believe, what Tiny Lister is saying. You know what I mean? That black and white fighting against each other, even on a movie, would make more sense because even Rocky, the movies that we connect with in Rocky 1 when he fought Apollo Creed, Rocky 2 when he fought Apollo Creed again, Rocky 3 when he fought Clubber Lang, we connected with on that level. Now, Rocky 4, that's geopolitics, that's Russia versus America, that's an old rivalry as well. That goes back to the end of World War II when Russia took the east side of Germany, and we took the west side of Germany. And the Berlin Wall was built, and the Cold War, and all that stuff was still raging on in 1984 when they made the movie. So that's different. That's why that got a lot of support. But in 1990, Sylvester Stallone tried it again with a real life boxing White Hope Tommy the Duke Morrison, and it was a flop. So it relates to this. So in a sense, Tommy Lister, is right in a sense, that black versus white was going to sell more money. Now, another interesting fact, No Holds Barred is a flop. It's a cult classic by some. Some people love it, some people hate it. Most people hate it. You know what I mean? There's a funny scene in there where Hulk Hogan's picking up a guy who's his limo driver, supposed to be making fun of the time he choked out Richard Belzer, a television host and former star of Law and Order, with a front face lock, and he sued him, and Richard Belzer's house in the south of France is Shea Hogan, because he sued the shit out of Hulk Hogan and the WWF. Hogan and Mr. T are going around in 1984 promoting WrestleMania 1. So he chokes him out. So the scene in the movie is like Hogan picking him up and going, "What's that smell?" And he goes, "Dookie," and the guy shitted on himself, right? So, and then there's this guy Brill, the villain of the movie, and this guy Brill is trying to lure Hulk Hogan's character Rip into his promotion. Now this was obviously a wink and a nod to Ted Turner, who had just gotten to the wrestling business, in 1988, like I said, the year before, and he calls up Vince and says, "Vince, I'm in the wrestling business," right? And Vince says, "Good, Ted, I'm in the entertainment business." and he hangs up, the phone on him. So he's like taking a shot at him with this character of Brill. Brell, right? You know, Brell's trying to lower Hulk Hogan, and oddly enough, 4 years later or 5 years later, it does happen. Brell, the evil TV producer, does lure the number one baby face of the other promotion, WWF, to the WCW. So I mean, art imitated life in that case. But anyway, the movie is a semi-success. Its opening week did pretty well. You know what I mean? But after like a couple of times people saw it, it flopped. But it is what it is. And they decided to bring Tommy Lister into an angle. And like I said, when he first premiered in the cage match, it was a cage match of Big Bubba. The Big Boss Man. Now he's the Big Boss Man in the WWF, and Hulk Hogan. And they're in the cage on Saturday night's main event, and Zeus comes out, and Jesse Ventura is like, "This is real life, Gorilla. This is not a movie, Gorilla. This is real life." And there is Zeus, this monster of a man. He couldn't do really shit because he didn't know how to wrestle. He wasn't a wrestler. He was a movie actor. But a funny story that Bruce Pritchard tells, and Hannibal Hannibal, the wrestling shooter guy on YouTube, has an interview with Tiny about this. Dusty Wolf, who he says in his book, not in his book, in his interview with Peter Rosenberg, he says, the guy is Dusty Rhodes. Now, obviously, Dusty Rhodes is in the WWF at this time. You know what I mean? But he's not driving Zeus around. He's not the biggest star. He's not the star he was in the late 70s when he came to wrestle superstar Billy Graham. But he's still a star, And, he's not going to be driving Zeus around. It's the same first name, Dusty Wolf, this jobber guy from Texas, right? This enhancement talent from Texas driving around. So he pulls up in a red convertible, and Tiny Lister says, wait a minute, I'm not driving that. I'm a blue guy, not a red guy. Now Dusty Wolf, a white guy from Texas, he has no idea what he's talking about. I'm a blue guy, a red guy. Obviously, and Hannibal asked him about this, are you a Crip or a Blood? Obviously, Tiny comes from Compton, California, not bitch-ass Arkansas. There was a rumor around that Tiny Lister came from Arkansas. So he goes, no, I didn't come from Arkansas. I came from Compton, California. So being so, Hannibal asked him, why did you say that? Are you a Crip or Blood? Are you a Crip? Is that why you don't want to ride around in a red car? He goes, no, I'm not a Crip, but I come from a blue neighborhood. I come from basically a Crip neighborhood. And I'm not going to disrespect, the people that I grew up with, especially my manager, Big U, who's a famous Rolling 60s. You know what I mean? So he wasn't a Crip, but he was affiliated in his area, in his neighborhood. You know what I mean? And the world he's in professional wrestling, people are not going to know about that. And it was not, even though Colors came out in 1988, and that movie kind of introduced people to the world of Los Angeles gang culture. It existed in California for 20 years before that. 20 years before 1989. It started in 1969, in South Central Los Angeles by Raymond Washington and Stanley Tukey Williams. You know what I mean? But it was not known nationally. Like I said, it was featured in Colors, but it was not something nationally. So he's not going to know why he doesn't want to drive in a red car. You know what I mean? But that was the reason. Even though, Tiny was a Christian, he wasn't a gangbanger. He had friends who was a gangbanger, so he respected, that sort of thing. And other instances when Tiny happened, in the wrestling business, particularly with other black wrestlers, right? Because we know the story about Bad News Brown. Bad News Brown, of course, Bad News Allen in the Calgary territory. You know, was one of the biggest heels, one of the best, biggest heels in the WWF in the late '80s when he came into the WWF as Bad News Allen. But and he supposedly he's a judo master. He's a master of martial arts. He supposedly was going to win the WWF Championship uh, from Hulk Hogan in 1990. So now, back in the day, promoters in the territories would, they would have their troupe of wrestlers, and they would only have like one black wrestler. So when another black wrestler would come in, that black wrestler that was working in that territory, like let's say Tony Atlas, for example, right? Tony Atlas um, would be in the Georgia territory, and SD Jones, SD Special Delivery Jones, would come into the Georgia territory, let's say from Memphis, right? Hypothetically, I don't know if SD was ever in Memphis, but say hypothetically SD was in Memphis and he came into Georgia. Now Georgia, Virginia, that's Tony Atlas's home territory, right? That's where he's from, right? But Tony Atlas would then be pushed out for SD Jones. Well, it would probably work the other way around, honestly, because Tony Atlas looks how Tony Atlas looks, and he had main event build in a lot of places he went, especially in Georgia in the early '80s, where him and Wildfire Tommy Rich were on top. But SD would be pushed down the card, or some other black wrestler. So Bad News was used to that mentality in the world of professional wrestling. So when he saw this big dude from Compton, California, Crip affiliated, and by the way, the Crips didn't start in Compton, but they spread to Compton early on with the help of this guy, this dude named Mac Thomas. And that's where the rivalry began with the Pyrus, that led to the gang war we know today. But anyway, he sees this dude from Compton, California, coming, into the promotion, and he's an outsider, and he has fame in other places because Tiny was on Perfect Strangers, the sitcom on ABC, for a cameo appearance, but he still was there, and he's much bigger and much in shape. So he goes, hey, my title shot against Hogan went out the window. You know what I'm saying? I'm not gonna get the title shot against Hogan. This other big black dude is gonna get it. But I don't feel like Bad News. I feel like Vince just was blowing smoke up Bad News Brown's ass, because Bad News Brown, although a great wrestler, although a great judo player or whatever in the Olympics, was not so charismatic. So I feel like if they were going to put the belt on a black guy, they would have put it on Debo / Zeus / Tiny Lister first before putting it on Bad News Allen. But anyway, this causes heat between the two, and then Bad News is pushed down the card, and as we'll see later on at WrestleMania 6 at this event in 1990, Bad News is going to be wrestling Roddy Piper in a very controversial, in a very controversial scene in the history of Roddy Piper's career. And we'll talk about it when we get to that match. But Bad News is pretty much forgotten about. So they have the match in the movie, the No Holds Barred special. They air the movie, and they have a final match between Zeus and Hulk Hogan, and he wins, and that's the end of Zeus in wrestling. Now, according to Tiny Lister, he until 1996 for 6 years, and then he comes back and unskins as Z Gangsta. And in between that time, he appears on Friday, appears in Don Juan DeMarco with Johnny Depp and Marlon Brando as another Compton character. Everything in his life besides his roles in wrestling and his roles in the Dark Knight, in 2008, pretty much revolved around this street persona of being from Compton. Because Friday was so successful, and he was in gang related too, as we mentioned yesterday with Tupac's last movie. And he was in Remember the Time, Michael Jackson. When he passed away in 2020, I said he worked with the who's who in the entertainment industry. He was a legend. But according to him, he was supposed to be the first black WWF champion. He was supposed to win the title and wrestle Hulk Hogan at WrestleMania 6. But that doesn't happen. Another thing that was supposed to happen that was interracial at WrestleMania 6, but doesn't happen, supposedly, according to Bruce Pritchard, was supposed to be a boxer versus wrestler match between Mike Tyson, who's a huge wrestling fan, and Hulk Hogan. And Mike Tyson, I don't know if he was playing around or he's just being a mark or whatever. He says, "I'm not getting in the ring with Hulk Hogan, man. I'm scared of Hulk." But whatever. It was supposed to be. There were talks of it, but then Mike Tyson loses to Buster Douglas. The first loss in his career, gets knocked out in Tokyo, in Japan, and that's the end of that. So they have to bring Buster Douglas in as the referee for a match between Randy Savage and Hulk Hogan. So what are they going to do for WrestleMania 6? Well, currently, the Ultimate Warrior is the Intercontinental Champion. As we talked about yesterday in yesterday's video, he regained the championship from Ravishing Rick Rude. So the logic that Vince has is babyface versus babyface. The Ultimate Challenge, the Ultimate Warrior versus Hulk Hogan for the championship. And that's where we begin our journey in 1990. It's the Royal Rumble. And again, once again, in this Royal Rumble, nothing is at stake, just bragging rights. So the champion, Hulk Hogan, is in the match, and he wins the match. Now, supposedly, they say that Curt Hennig, who just came into the promotion in 1980, I believe it's 80. Yeah, it was 88. I believe 88 or 89. His first WrestleMania was 89. Yeah, it was 89 because he dropped the AWA championship to Jerry Lawler in that classic match in 88. So maybe he came in 89, but he didn't wrestle his first WrestleMania match until 89 against the Blue Blazer at WrestleMania 5. Right, we talked about it. The two Trump WrestleManias. WrestleMania 5, where the Mega Powers explode. Shawn Michaels also debuts on WrestleMania 5, wrestling Hakeem and the Big Boss Man, the Twin Towers, as the Rockers. After coming in like in '87 and being fired, for that bad behavior and having been forced to go back down to Memphis and humble himself, and wrestle in Memphis, the Rock and Roll Express are in Memphis at this time too. He's invited back to the WWF, and this is where he basically becomes Mr. WrestleMania, and he establishes the reputation that he establishes that we talked a lot about on this channel. So that's WrestleMania. It's his WrestleMania debut. So Mr. Perfect is on a winning streak, basically. Mr. Perfect is coming into the WWF, cool vignettes and everything. Just like I said, hot off being the AWA champion, one of the last AWA champions that people really cared about, because, like I said, the AWA championship tarnished after Hulk Hogan failed to win it at AWA Super Sunday in 1983. Basically just tarnished. No reputation whatsoever. So Jerry Lawler wins it, from Curt Hennig, and Jerry Lawler holds on to it for a while because AWA is doing this thing with Memphis, the Super Clash 3, which takes place in 1989 as well, where Kerry Von Erich, who's the WCCW champion, we talked about how in '86 WCCW left the NWA, so now they have their own independent championship, and they're doing business with Memphis. And Jerry Jarrett, who's the promoter in Memphis at this time, is looking to buy both the AWA and World Class Championship Wrestling. He does in 1989 buy World Class Championship Wrestling from Fritz von Erich's sons, David and Carrie. I mean, excuse me, not David. Pardon self. David was passed away by then. Um, uh, Kevin and Carrie, who are both addicted to drugs, and in the Von Erich's video, I say what Fritz himself told Jerry Jarrett. Don't listen to these guys. They're two dope fiends. They don't know what they're talking about anyway. He buys it, and then they try to sue. They try to sue him back to get it back. He tries to buy the AWA, but Vern won't sell it unless Greg has a prominent position in it. And Greg was never a great wrestler. He was only featured in the AWA a lot because his father owned the territory. So Jerry Jarrett's like, no, I'm not buying that. So they quit doing Memphis, the CWA, quits doing business with the NWA, and that's that. They go their separate ways. But AWA has their first and only pay-per-view at Super Clash 3 in '89. And it's a bloodbath between Jerry the King Lawler and Kerry Von Erich. And Vince McMahon calls the cable companies to inform them, I mean, not the cable companies, the Chicago State Athletic Commission, the Illinois State Athletic Commission, because they're having it in Chicago, right? That was the home base of AWA. Now, AWA is on its last leg. Vince doesn't need to do this, but he feels the need to do it. He feels the need to do it anyway, and he does it. And they don't care. They have the match still. And Kerry Von Erich is hell of inebriated. Here's Jerry Lawler, a teetotaler. He's never done any drugs, never drank or anything. And Kerry Von Erich is completely high out of his mind, doesn't know where he's coming or going. He even has the blades. The blades used to cut himself during the match because they're going to get a little color during this match. He has it on his the streamers on his wrist, and he's flailing his arms around high, and he's cutting himself like crazy. That's why this match is a complete bloodbath. But here's the hypocrite that Vince is. The hypocrite that Vince is, in 1990, Vince hires Kerry Von Erich to be one of his wrestlers and brings Kerry Von Erich in as the Texas Tornado. So you're saying that it's unhealthy for a one-legged man to wrestle in a wrestling match, which it is, and you're saying that it's unlawful, but for you don't care. But he didn't have Vince McMahon didn't have the state athletic commissions on his back, because in 1989, he went to the New Jersey State Athletic Commission, he and Linda McMahon, and they finally admitted to the world what we'd already known for generations, but nobody in the wrestling business outside of Jack Pfeffer to the New York papers in the 1930s had ever admitted, and that wrestling is fake. Wrestling is not real, not a real sports competition, so they shouldn't be subject to the State Athletic Commission's rules. So it didn't matter when Kerry Von Erich came to his promotion to wrestle. So Kerry leaves World Class Championship Wrestling and goes to the WWF, and we'll be seeing him especially, in the coming months as he becomes the Intercontinental Champion in the WWF after it's held up. So anyway, but as of now, the Ultimate Warrior, another guy from World Class Championship Wrestling, has come to the WWF. He defeats the Honky Tonk Man unanimously, and of course at WrestleMania 5, he loses the championship to Rick Rude, another World Class Champion, WCCW alum. With Bobby Heenan holding his foot. The weirdest costume that the Ultimate Warrior ever wore was his costume at WrestleMania 5, where he has like yellow tights and black boots. Like, what was that about? But anyway, he wins it back at SummerSlam. So going into WrestleMania, he's the Intercontinental Champion. Hogan is the World Champion. So it's a Royal Rumble. Anyway, but according to rumors, Mr. Perfect, on his perfect streak, he was managed by the genius at this time, Lenny Poffo, Randy Savage's brother. He was supposed to win the Royal Rumble in 1990. But Hogan mixed it, and Hogan wins. You know what I mean? Hogan wins the Royal Rumble, the third Royal Rumble in history. He wins it, and it was during this Royal Rumble where he and the Ultimate Warrior have a face-off. They've eliminated everybody, and they have this face-off, this colossal face-off, where they tease it. They tease what they're going to do on April 1st, 1990 at WrestleMania 6. They teased the Ultimate Challenge, and it was epic. And they've repeated it several times. You know, after that, they repeated it at this year's Royal Rumble in 2024 with CM Punk versus Cody Rhodes. They repeated it again in 2007 with The Undertaker and Shawn Michaels. They've done it several times. You know what I mean? They didn't do Cody Rhodes versus CM Punk yet. Um, but they, 2 years later, they did The Undertaker versus Shawn Michaels, and it turned out to be, they teased it in '07, they did it in '09, it turned out in Houston, Texas, and it turned out to be one of the greatest wrestling matches in history. So they do it here in 1990. So Hogan wins the Royal Rumble. Then going on to WrestleMania, now they've decided it's going to be title for title. So Hogan could possibly become the Intercontinental Champion, or the Ultimate Warrior could become the WWF Champion. Well, we all know what happened. The Ultimate Warrior becomes the WWF Champion for the first and only time. And Hogan, it's a decent back and forth match. People laugh at it now because certain things have been turned into memes, like when Hogan and Warrior go for the Greco-Roman knuckle lock, and Warrior's on his knees and he looks like he's sucking Hogan's dick. You know what I mean? People have made jokes about that, or how slow the pacing is. But think about it. Hogan and Warrior were never known for their Mac classics, and they pulled it off. The Toronto Sky Dome. Half the crowd was for Hogan. Half the crowd was for Warrior. Edge was in the crowd. Christian, who would themselves later become WWE stars, was in the crowd. And they both were Hulkamaniacs and pulling for Hogan. Because Hogan was big in Canada. As we talked about before, in 1986, in Toronto, he sold it out, going against his former tag team partner and the guy he headlined WrestleMania 1 with a year before, but on opposing sides, Mr. Wonderful Paul Orndorff. And we talked about it. We haven't touched on 2002, but if we ever do touch on 2002, they returned to this building in 2002 with Hulk Hogan versus The Rock. Hogan had been going from WWE for 9 years. He left in '93, and he comes back and he wrestles The Rock, who's been the biggest star, one of the two biggest stars of the Attitude Era, in Toronto, in the Sky Dome, same building where he lost to the Ultimate Warrior, and they just flip. They start booing The Rock and cheering Hulk Hogan. Because Hogan's back in the WWF and he's back in Canada, one of his biggest markets. And then again in 2005, the lead into SummerSlam 2005, he's going against Shawn Michaels. Shawn Michaels cuts that infamous "Who's Your Daddy" Montreal promo where they tease Bret Hart coming out. And he's again, they're cheering Hogan in Montreal. So Hogan is big time in Montreal, big time in Canada, big time in Toronto. And the first WrestleMania outside of the United States in Toronto, and it's a big hit. Other big storylines from WrestleMania 6 that I remember is Dusty Rhodes' moment. Like we talked about, Dusty Rhodes is here in the WWF after being fired from Jim Crockett Promotions in 1988. He's here in the WWF. He's with Sweet Sapphire, if you will. He's in polka dots. And, his NWA fans, they don't really like him in polka dots. They say that it was one of the blotches on his career. But he makes it work, man. He makes it really work, and it gets over. It got over with kids like me, the Sweet Sapphire, when you bring kids into the ring and dance and everything. It was cool. So they had this idea, and Lisa wanted me to talk about women's wrestling. They have this, and we're bringing it back to women's wrestling. They have this idea for a mixed tag match. Sherry teaming with the Macho King Randy Savage, coming out of being semi-retired, against Sapphire and Dusty Rhodes. And what does Dusty Rhodes bring out? The crown jewel, baby. Miss Elizabeth. He said, I got the crown jewel. He said, ain't no king and queens no more in the World Wrestling Federation. And I miss Dusty, man. He was saying his promos were much better than his son Cody's. Rest in peace, Dusty Rhodes. The American dream, that the road baby. pay window. He took it to the pay window at WrestleMania 6 in 1990. And then he brings out Miss Elizabeth. And Miss Elizabeth gets involved. She attacks Sherry, and she cost Macho Man and Sherry the match. She was the crown jewel, baby. You know, but it won't be all roses for Dusty Rhodes and Sapphire in the coming months, I assure you. And we'll talk about it later. Speaking of turning face and heel and flipping, we have Andre the Giant is now one half of the World Tag Team Champions with Haku. Haku, the former King of the Ring, now is a member of the Colossal Connection with Andre the Giant. And they're taking on Demolition. Now, Demolition are baby faces now. They defeated Strikeforce at WrestleMania 5, led to the breakup of Strikeforce. And, you know, Tito Santana and Rick Martel, they formed the team in 1987 after Tom Zink left the promotion. Apparently, Tom Zink and Rick Martel couldn't get along. Some people say because they were gay lovers and they broke up. And that eventually led to the breakup of the team. Remember, I don't know if we ever talked about it on this channel, but at WrestleMania 3, they were in the opener against Bob Orton and Don Morocco. Managed, I think it was by Slick or Mr. Fuji, one of the two. But anyway, they got rid of that team and they put Tito Santana and Rick Martel together. One Canadian, one Mexican. You know, so it wasn't the Can-Am connection anymore, the Canadian-American connection. It was the Can-Mex-Am connection. A Mexican-American and a French-Canadian. How about that? Years before Eddie Guerrero and Chris Benoit. But at WrestleMania 5, they broke up. Rick Martel refused to take the tag, and he just walked out on the team and turned heel on Tito Santana. Well, he becomes the model Rick Martel. And the opening match of WrestleMania 6 is him, and Shane McMahon appears at WrestleMania 6 as well as a referee, is the model Rick Martel versus Coco Beware. So we'll be seeing a lot of the model Rick Martel in 1990 with his arrogance. We'll be seeing a lot more of him the following year in 1991 when he has his blindfold match against Jake the Snake Roberts. But Tito Santana does nothing, you know, of note in this. And, you know, this was one of those WrestleMania where they had a celebrity. So they had Steve Allen, the former host of The Tonight Show, as one of the celebrities, and he's busting into the locker room of the Bolsheviks, Boris Zukov and Nikolai Volkov. Now, I find it funny that they finally come up with a team called the Bolsheviks a year away from when the Soviet Union is about to collapse. The Berlin Wall has already come down. It came down a year before in 1989, and their record falls just as fast as the Berlin Wall because they have a match with the Hart Foundation that lasts a couple of seconds. The Bolsheviks, you know, the Russians have already turned babyface in Jim Crockett Promotions. Nikita Koloff is already a babyface teaming with Dusty Rhodes. He was teaming with Dusty Rhodes when Dusty Rhodes was there as a superpower. So I don't really get why they're still running with this Russian heel thing in WWF, but that's about to change as Nikolai Volkov is about to be embraced by the babyface side in the WWF, and that's going to anger one of Nikolai Volkov's adversaries who's coming back to the promotion, Sergeant Slaughter. And we'll see how Sergeant Slaughter comes back in the Brother Love show at SummerSlam. But as far as WrestleMania 6, um, Andre the Giant loses the match against Demolition. Like I said, Demolition now baby faces. They three-peat. They become the WWF Tag Team Champions for the third time. And Andre the Giant, he's in bad condition here. He hardly moves. He's leaning on the rope the whole time. Haku wrestled the whole match. And Bobby Heenan comes out, and Bobby Heenan starts berating Andre the Giant after they lost. He says, "You listen to me. You listen to me. I'm the fucking boss. I'm the fucking boss." He tells Andre, and you could hear it. You could hear it on TV. He goes, "I'm the fucking," and he slaps Andre, right? And Andre just flips. And Andre, for the first time since 1987, when he walked out on Piper's Pit with Bobby Heenan, he ripped off Hogan's crucifix, right? And Hogan was like, "Andre, please." He challenged him. "I challenge you to a match at the WrestleMania." 3 years before that. That was at WrestleMania 3. That's WrestleMania 6. "I challenge you to a match at WrestleMania," he tells Hogan. And then they have their epic match. And they go on to feud the whole entire year, 1988. A lot in 89, Hogan kind of moves on, and Andre kind of moves on. But it was interesting because they had the carts that bring you to the ring at WrestleMania 3, and they had him again at WrestleMania 6. So he was a heel on one of the carts, became a heel on one of the carts, and left as a babyface on another one where they had the carts. So it's kind of a bookend of Andre's career. Andre was mostly a babyface, throughout his whole career. In the 70s, when he was wrestling in France, he was a babyface. When he would go around the country and win battle royals in this territory and that territory, he was a babyface. But they had the idea to turn him heel because they wanted to have this epic match, and that's what they did. And they did have the epic match, but now he's winding his career down, so they turned him babyface again. It was a pretty cool moment. It was something I always remember from WrestleMania 6. And as far as the main event, like I said, people say it was hokey, people say whatever, but it was pretty cool to me, man. Seeing the Ultimate Warrior and Hulk Hogan. And the promos were pretty cool. Edge and Christian always nailed the parody of these promos. With Ultimate Warrior, "You Hulk Hogan will feel the power of the warrior." And he knocked Sean Mooney. Like, Sean Mooney's interviewing Ultimate Warrior in the back, right? He's like, "You don't deserve to breathe the same air that I and Hulk Hogan do. Physically, none of us can live forever, but I," and I'm paraphrasing, "through me and through the power of my warriors, you, Hulk Hogan, will bring the Warriors and the Hulkamaniacs together as one." And it's just like crazy, traditional Ultimate Warrior type shit. But we're going to have a lot of that in 1990 because Ultimate Warrior becomes the WWF champion. So what happens with the Intercontinental title? Now he's the Intercontinental champion. He has to give it up. So they put it up in a tournament, and the tournament finals are Tito Santana and Kurt Hennig. Kurt Hennig wins the Intercontinental Championship. So even though he didn't win the Royal Rumble, I guess as a consolation prize, whatever, he becomes the Intercontinental Champion. He does, have a match with Brutus Beefcake where he seemingly loses, to Brutus Beefcake. So Brutus Beefcake is the one who ends his streak. Whatever. What a big letdown. Brutus the fucking Barber Beefcake. He knew friends in high places, right? Hulk Hogan. So that's WrestleMania 6. Now, like I always say, hey Lisa, what's going on? Like I always say, at this time in the WWF's history, they only had 4 pay-per-views. So we move on from WrestleMania to SummerSlam. So months and months go by, but what's happening in these months? There's a lot going on in these preceding months. One of the things that's going on is Earthquake, John Tenta. Now, Earthquake does wrestle at WrestleMania 6, right? But it's not a big feud, right? It's not something earth-shattering, if you will. He's the Canadian Earthquake. He's teaming with Gino Bravo and Jimmy Hart as his manager. But he's about to be ushered into the main event scene. On an episode of the Brother Love Show, Hulk Hogan is there, and Hulk Hogan is attacked by John Tenta, by Earthquake. And he sits on him, he squashes him like a bug, and puts Hulk Hogan out of commission. Now, if you're a kid watching this, right, he did this to the Ultimate Warrior before when he first came in, right? But you didn't think anything of it with the Ultimate Warrior because, first of all, he came in as a fan, right? That was the thing. He was a guy in the audience. That Ultimate Warrior said he could do push-ups with him on his back, and he comes down and crushed the Ultimate Warrior. But now it's like he's crushing Hogan. And as a kid watching this, it's aired on Superstars, you're like, oh my God, Hulk Hogan just died. And that's the way they made it seem. You know what I mean? Like Hulk Hogan was in serious trouble, and they had a letter writing campaign, to send Hulk Hogan cards and letters to help him get better. Right? This was a big thing in the WWF at this time, to help him get back on his feet and help him, eventually get revenge on Earthquake at SummerSlam and all that stuff. So, point being, the end of the match with the Ultimate Warrior, Hulk Hogan hands the Ultimate Warrior the WWF Championship, but he's all teary-eyed, he's crying and everything. Now, I think it would have been appropriate at that time for Hogan to just turn heel, raise the Ultimate Warrior's hand, and hit the Ultimate Warrior, and then say, that's it. He says in a later interview that's what he wanted to do. Like, I wanted to come out the next week on Monday Night Raw and turn heel. I told Vince, but Vince was like, no, we're not doing that. First of all, that's a lie. That probably never happened because there was no Monday Night Raw in 1990. Monday Night Raw didn't debut on the USA Network until January of 1993. So Hogan's lying right there. Just like he says, the only time he took steroids was his first reign as champion in 1983. He wasn't the champion in 1983. He wasn't even in WWE in 1983. So that's a lie. Him being the bassist for Metallica, that's a lie. Hulk Hogan's lies are notorious. Right? He tells these huge-ass lies. Oh, him and Andre the Giant had the match at WrestleMania 3, and Andre died a couple of weeks later. Meanwhile, Andre didn't die until 1993. Like, come on, really? Like, does he think people can't Google these facts? Whatever. But I doubt he ever approached Vince McMahon about turning heel. But anyway, he didn't do that, but he stole the show, and people wanted to see him back. So he's in this feud with Earthquake, and Earthquake injures his ribs, and finally he comes back. He sets the match for SummerSlam, and it's the main event match, even though the Ultimate Warrior is the champion. The Ultimate Warrior is the WWF champion, and he's in the undercard against Rick Rude in a cage match. You know what I mean? So Hogan, once again, like he did with the Macho Man in '88, he's stealing the spotlight from the Ultimate Warrior throughout most of '90. As the Warrior is the champion, because people are forgetting about the Warrior and people are focusing on Hogan feud with Earthquake. So he has the match with Earthquake, and it's not a bad match at all, necessarily. But a match I do want to point out that I loved, and it's a 2 out of 3 falls match. Demolition, they still hold the championship, but they turn heel once again. And Bill Eadie, apparently Bill Eadie was out with a shellfish injury, a shellfish allergy, because, they say. So they swap him in with Crush. And this is the first time that they bring Bryan Adams, Crush, on the scene as the third member of Demolition. And Demolition now have a Freebird rule, basically, where they're a 3-man team now, and any 2 of the 3 could wrestle and defend the WWF Tag Team Championships. And they're wrestling against the Hart Foundation, who are now baby faces in a best 2 out of 3 falls match. And this is to me SummerSlam, because SummerSlam '89, that was when the Hart Foundation first became baby faces. They turned on Jimmy Hart, and they wrestled. I think it was the Brain Busters, right? Yeah, let me look that up. Yeah, it was 1989. The Hart Foundation took on the Brain Busters, and they were baby faces then, right? Because Jimmy Hart had dumped them to manage the Rougeau brothers when the Rougeau brothers turned heel. So they'd already been baby faces, but in that match with the Brain Busters, Arn Anderson and Tully Blanchard was pretty cool. I ain't gonna front that it wasn't cool. It was, right? But to me, the match with Demolition is the match that cemented Bret Hart and what he will, in my opinion, in my estimation, he will become Mr. SummerSlam. Just as Shawn Michaels was Mr. WrestleMania, he will become Mr. SummerSlam because this match is awesome. They're wrestling smash and crush of Demolition. And who appears there? Who appears at SummerSlam 1990? But the team that was from Jim Crockett Promotions that everybody wanted to see wrestle for years throughout the 80s, just like Hulk Hogan and Ric Flair in the singles world for years throughout the 80s. In the tag team world, people wanted to see WCW / the NWA's greatest tag team in the Road Warriors wrestle WWF's greatest tag team in Demolition. And finally, it's happening. Because the Road Warriors left Jim Crockett Promotions and they WCW because they didn't like Jim Herd either, and they came to the WWF. So now they're in the WWF and people want to see them wrestle Demolition. Unfortunately, it doesn't happen. I mean, it happens, but Crush is the member of Demolition at that time, not Axe. It's Crush and Smash. So, I mean, that's not the Demolition we wanted to see go against the Road Warriors in the 80s. You know what I mean? And basically, LOD just dominates. And a year later, LOD in Madison Square Garden in 1991, on my birthday, defeats the Nasty Boys for the WWF Tag Team Championships. And we'll get to that when we get to 1991. But anyway, in 1990, SummerSlam, they come out and they help the Hart Foundation. Because, even the odds, if you will, on behalf of the Hart Foundation. And the Hart Foundation are the new WWF Tag Team Champions. So, and also Kerry Von Erich defeats Mr. Perfect for the Intercontinental Championship. Because like I said, he is now in the WWF. Kerry Von Erich was world champion, NWA champion in 1984. The David Von Erich Memorial Show when his brother first died over in Japan, and they gave it to him out of sympathy, but he didn't last with it, and he was World Class Championship Wrestling champion for a while, and he didn't last even with that title, and that was his famous promotion. But here he's in the big time now. He wouldn't really last there, his drug problems got the best of him. He quickly dropped the belt again to Mr. Perfect. He was there until 1993. And that's when he left and then ultimately committed suicide. Unalived himself, unalived himself in 93. 93 was a sad year for professional wrestling. We have it in the year in review in the archives. But particularly for the WWF with the death of both Texas Tornado and Andre the Giant and Dino Bravo. So that's SummerSlam 1990. Now we go into Survivor Series. Now Survivor Series is very unique in this Survivor Series because 5-on-5 Strive to Survive. That was the theme of Survivor Series since 1987 when it debuted. Teams of five strive to survive. Elimination matches, traditional Survivor Series matches. But they added a caveat in 1990 for this. The caveat was that they would have these matches, and the sole survivors of these matches would go on to a main event match where they would be a team, and then they would have like a final of final matches, right? So it ends up being Tito Santana, Ultimate Warrior, and Hulk Hogan. And it's a pretty unique concept, but at the same time, it's convoluted because Survivor Series was already good the way it was. But it's weird seeing Tito Santana, who's like this. Well, basically by 1990, he's basically like this jobber because he would go on, like we talked about, years before, 1993 video, he would go on to have the El Matador gimmick soon after. Now, he was big in the early 80s, the early WrestleMania days. He was Intercontinental Champion, right? Savage beat him in 86. He wrestled the very first match at WrestleMania, right? At the very first WrestleMania. And Tito was always very important and always the backbone, if you will. And in the 70s, he was the backbone of the Hispanic demographic, in the WWF after Pedro Morales retired. But by this time, it was weird to see him in a main event. But what's another? And we're already in Iraq by this point, and that's a real theme of this show, is the whole support of the troops. Because again, we hadn't been in a war, in over 15 years. At this point, 15 years basically. We hadn't been in a war since 1975, since the end of Vietnam. So, like, America's for the first time in a war, right? And it's a big theme of this show. Roddy Piper mentions it like a bunch of times because at this time they were still having, Survivor Series on Thanksgiving. So like he's like, shout out to the troops who can't be at home in this holiday for their families and everything, and it's talked about. So, but besides that, a big theme of this show is a giant egg, and it's crazy that I mentioned the Guerreros early on in the beginning of this video. A giant egg is being talked about, and everybody's wondering, well, what's going to come out of this egg? What's going to come out of this egg? And what comes out of the egg is Hector Guerrero, Eddie's other brother, in a chicken suit. But what was speculated to come out of the egg was the debut of this name. And I'll get back to it, in a little while, after we talk about Dusty Rhodes. Because Dusty Rhodes figures in to this storyline. So I mentioned Dusty Rhodes and Sapphire win the match against the Macho Man, right? So him and Sapphire are cool, they're getting along, and Sapphire is still in the feud with Sherry. And tying it back into women's wrestling, like Lisa wanted me to talk about, they have a women's match at SummerSlam between Sapphire and Sherry. And over the course of the weeks, Sapphire's coming out with this expensive stuff. She's coming out with mink coat. She's coming out with jewelry. And people are wondering, well, how's she getting all this stuff? Dusty Rhodes is wondering. So SummerSlam 1990, it's time for his match with the Macho King Randy Savage, and nobody can find Sapphire. There's that famous skit in the back where Sapphire is like, where Dusty Rhodes is like, hey, Jim Duggan, have you seen Sapphire? I don't know where she at, baby. And she's like, and he's looking around for Sapphire and everything. But Sapphire, her match comes with Sherry, and nobody can find Sweet Sapphire. Where is she? Well, turns out she sold out to the $1 Million Man. She has been bought, as the $1 Million Man often said. Everybody's got a price for the $1 Million Man. You know, she sold out to the $1 Million Man. He's been buying her the mink coats. He's been buying her the jewelry. He's been buying this. He's been buying that. She's now a heel. You know what I mean? So once again, just like with Virgil, the $1 Million Man, Ted DiBiase, purchased the services of a black person. You know, they wouldn't really talk about this, you know, nowadays in the woke, you know, politically correct. I really hate the term woke, but anyway, in the politically correct climate of today's world, they wouldn't really talk about this. But in 1990, boy, this was some crazy shit. This was crazy shit, for real. Like, he was actually buying the services of a black person, Sapphire. Bad enough her name was Sapphire, which harkens back to a racist trope found in the it was a famous radio show in the 1940s, which became an early television show, Amos and Andy. And one of the women on that show was named Sapphire. And it was Bad News Allen who came up to Vince McMahon and said, look, I don't co-sign you naming Juanita Wright that, you know, when she came in as Dusty's manager. You know what I mean? Like, that's a racist name. You know, why are you naming her that? But he did it anyway. So we're bad enough with that. And now she's being bought. Her services are being bought by the $1 Million Man, Ted DiBiase. It was a really weird storyline. Anyway, that begins the feud with Dusty Rhodes and the $1 Million Man. So at circling back to Survivor Series, at Survivor Series, Dusty Rhodes has a team and the $1 Million Man has a team. And the $1 Million Man, Ted DiBiase, brings out, and this cross references with 1994. Because when I talk about when he brought out the fake Undertaker right after Undertaker kayfabe died after the casket match with Yokozuna at the Royal Rumble that year, he brings out the Undertaker. Now, nobody has seen the Undertaker. Nobody knows who the Undertaker is. He wasn't, and we'll talk about it when we backtrack to WCW. He was in WCW for 2 matches, or 3 matches. Capital Combat. He wrestled at Wrestle War 90, and he wrestled at the Great American Bash 1990 against Lex Luger for the U.S. Championship. Those were the 3 matches he wrestled in. Capital Combat 1990, he wrestled against the Road Warriors, but these were the Skyscrapers at that time. It wasn't. I think it was Danny Spivey. It was his partner, and then, you know, later on, that's when he was managed by Teddy Long. Later on, he was managed by Paulie Dangerously as Mean Mark Callis after he left the Skyscrapers. But you know, Vince McMahon had gotten wind of him. It's not true that Hogan met him on the set of Suburban Commando. Suburban Commando came out the following year, and yes, Undertaker was in it, but Hulk Hogan did not discover the Undertaker. Vince McMahon discovered him, and he decided to bring him in as the Dead Man character. And at first, Brother Love was his manager, Bruce Pritchard, but Vince gave Brother Love the ultimatum. You know, you could be a producer or you could be on the road as this character, Brother Love, and Bruce chose to be on the road. So they bring in Percy Pringle, who was a manager in World Class Championship Wrestling. He was Rick Rude's manager. He was a famous manager, but World Class is gone now. Jerry Jarrett has bought it. He's merged it with CWA. It's now the USWA. And he decides to go to the WWF. Now, they don't know that Percy Pringle used to be an Undertaker. Like, that was his real life job. So when Vince McMahon and Pat Patterson find this out, they start laughing because Percy Pringle doesn't know what role they have in mind from to be the Undertaker's manager. When he becomes the Undertaker's manager, in an episode of the Brother Love Show, they hand The Undertaker services over to Percy Pringle as now Paul Bearer. And as a kid, I never got the references. The Undertaker, Paul Bearer. I didn't know that a Paul Bearer was real. I didn't know that the job of a guy that takes care of a mortuary, a funeral home is really the Undertaker. Like, it didn't occur to me as a kid. Just like Yokozuna and his connection to actual sumo wrestling didn't occur to me as a kid. I didn't get those references, but I got them later and as an adult, and I found them funny. Now, circling back to Roddy Piper, circling back to WrestleMania 6 and Roddy Piper, I said that Roddy Piper did something controversial. Now, Roddy Piper, in 1987, he had his so-called retirement match against Adrian Adonis at WrestleMania 3. Big fanfare. They see him off. He goes to shoot John Carpenter's They Live. He has the famous line, I came to do two things, kick ass and chew bubblegum, and I'm all out of bubblegum, right? He has that famous line. But after that, he doesn't do well. In Hollywood, his star kind of fades away. So in 1989 at WrestleMania 5, he has the segment with Brother Love, because we're circling back because we're mentioning Brother Love. After Roddy Piper leaves the WWF, and goes to Hollywood, they need a segment on superstars, wrestling challenge that will fill in for that, an interview segment. So they could come up with the Brother Love show. The concept of Brother Love is that he's a televangelist. At this time, there was with the scandals of Jim Baker, the televangelist, and Jimmy Stewart, the other televangelists who were caught cheating on their wives, philandering, if you will, and there were a lot of scandals around philanderous behaviors. Even during the presidential election with Gary Hart, not the wrestler Gary Hart, but the presidential candidate in 1988, Gary Hart. There were a lot of that around. So he becomes that. I love you. And I did the accent when I met him in 2017. I did the accent because I always liked Brother Love. And Brother Love was a huge part of the Dusty Rhodes, Randy Savage feud. Brother Love was a huge part of the Zeus angle. Brother Love was a huge part of, like we talked about, the Earthquake and Hulk Hogan angle, all that sort of stuff in 89, 90. But at WrestleMania 5, he does the segment with Roddy Piper. They're bringing back Piper's Pit, and he thinks, it's over for me because they're bringing back Roddy Piper, and Roddy Piper, is better than me at this, and they're bringing Morton Downey Jr. Morton Downey Jr. was basically Jerry Springer before Jerry Springer. He would smoke a lot on his show, which goes to show you the differences in the culture. Back then in the 80s, you could smoke. In the 80s and early 90s, you could smoke on TV, and he would do a lot of that. So that becomes a part of the storyline. He blows smoke in Piper's face, and Piper is like, I told you before, to stop blowing smoke in my face. So he beats up Brother Love, and then he uses the fire extinguisher, Roddy Piper does, on Morton Downey Jr., and Piper is back in the WWF. And in the Royal Rumble that year, he gets into a scuffle with Bad News Brown, and he leads to a match between himself and Bad News Brown. Now, here comes another lie. Apparently, he paints himself half black and half white. So he's the Hot Rod and the Hot Scott. Here's Roddy Piper in blackface in Canada. Like Roddy Piper, when he was feuding with Mr. T in the mid-'80s, he said a lot of racist things. Like he said that Mr. T wears chains on his neck like his ancestors and stuff. He said, do you think I wear a bunch of chains and cut my hair and paint myself black and all this kind of stuff? He was doing racially charged stuff. He was always doing that, going back to his days in the Los Angeles territory with the Cucaracha thing, like I spoke about. But this is 1990, and this is kind of weird to do this kind of thing. Like, why is he painting himself half black? Does it have anything to do with Bad News Brown and Bad News Brown's, conscious racial politics, in the company? Maybe, I don't know. But he says he's doing it in honor of Michael Jackson. Now, okay, people say, well, that makes sense because Michael Jackson had a song, Black or White, right? But Piper is doing this in 1990. Michael Jackson didn't have the song Black or White out until 1991. That makes no sense. Then he said he was out there doing it for promoting Cyndi Lauper's song. Cyndi Lauper did have a song out in 1990, an album coming out in 1990, so that makes sense. But what does that have to do with being black or white? Like, why did he have to appear in blackface? If that was Roddy Piper, he did crazy shit, right? So, so after that whole controversy, they retire him. Then Jesse Ventura leaves. WrestleMania 6 was Jesse Ventura's last time in WWF, so they started to put Piper on commentary. Piper and Bobby Heenan, as a 3-man commentary team, and like Piper and Randy Savage later in '91 when Randy Savage retires as a 3-man commentary team. But that's the end for 1990. A quick run around with WCW. Before I get off, because I've been here over an hour. With WCW, they have the Capital Combat show, one of the worst shows ever. The main event is Lex Luger versus Ric Flair, and they have RoboCop. Like, this is their idea. This is WCW's idea of bringing a celebrity in for a wrestling angle. WWE has Zeus. WWE has Mr. T. WWE has Cyndi Lauper. Who does WCW get? RoboCop. Yes, RoboCop interferes on behalf of Sting and Lex Luger, saving Sting and Lex Luger from a beatdown from the Four Horsemen. Now, going into 1989, Sting was a member of the Horsemen, right? But I said at Clash of the Champions in January, I said this before in other videos, particularly the 96 one when I gave Sting's relationship with the Horsemen the entire rundown, that Sting had become the #1 contender and Ric Flair was the champion. So Ric Flair's like, look, you can't wrestle me for the #1 contendership for the title because we're Horseman teammates. So they kick Ole Anderson, who's back in the company now as the booker, right? And he's also sleeping with the producer, Sharon Sadello. He's back as the booker. And he's also back as the Horseman. You know what I mean? So he kicks Sting out of the company. He kicks Sting out of the company, out of the Four Horsemen, and Sting tears his patella tendon. So the match he was supposed to have with Ric Flair is put off to the Great American Bash. So at Capital Combat, all he could do is come out with RoboCop, and the same thing at Wrestle War. He comes to accompany Lex Luger, and who do they bring in? An out of shape Junkyard Dog, and they form this babyface faction of Lex Luger, Sting, and the Junkyard Dog, who Dave Meltzer has taken to calling the Junk Food Dog, because at this time, JYD's drug problems, he was on crack, he was on heroin, all kinds of things. JYD's drug problems are notorious, to wrestling fans. They're taking a hold of him. But they thought he still had some star power left in him. He didn't. He nearly came this close at one Clash of Champions to beating Ric Flair for the NWA Championship, but thank God he didn't. He's so out of shape at this time in 1990. It was terrible. He's only there for a couple months, thank God. And Ric Flair, to hype the feud up, Ric Flair used a lot of racial shit in this too. Like, wrestling and racism in 1990 was kind of weird, because he comes out to save Rocky King, another black wrestler, and JYD does. And that's when Ric Flair starts calling him boy and everything. It's just weird. It's booked by Ole Anderson, so what do you expect? So Sting comes back. He wins the match against Ric Flair at the Great American Bash. Dressed in the outfit one of his sons was dressed in when he retired last year in AEW, the red, white, and blue. And this is actually the last Great American Bash they would have. They would retire the pay-per-view until 1995. But Sting comes out, he beats Ric Flair for it, but it doesn't last long. They quickly put the belt back on Ric Flair. And their next idea is to have Sid Vicious rejoined the Four Horsemen. Sid Vicious is now a member of the Horsemen now. Because Ole Anderson's not wrestling, so Sting's spot is taken up by Sid Vicious. So Sid Vicious and Sting have a match in Halloween Havoc 1990, where Sid Vicious thinks he pinned Sting, but he actually pinned Barry Windham, a Sting doppelganger. Okay, and now they're doing this thing with the Black Scorpion. The Black Scorpion would attack Sting, he would threaten Sting. It was this mysterious voice. It was voiced by Ole Anderson, but there's no plan in sight for this. There's no who's gonna be the Black Scorpion, who's eventually Sting gonna wrestle at Starrcade eventually to blow this whole thing off. There's no idea, right? Nobody knows. There's nobody. It's like with the mysterious Raw GM. Remember that a couple of years ago on Raw? Like nobody knows where it's going to end. He doesn't. It was supposed to be Latin lover Al Perez. Like that would have been a huge letdown if that was. No offense against Al Perez, but by 1990 he was nothing in the wrestling industry. You know what I mean? So who's it going to be? Who's it going to be? It was either a toss-up event. I heard, besides the Al Perez rumor, I heard it was either a toss-up between Barry Windham, who was already in the Four Horsemen, and who it eventually became Ric Flair. Eventually, Sting has the match with the Black Scorpion at Starrcade 1990, and he pulls the mask off, and it's Ric Flair, another Ric Flair Sting match, and that's how we go out in 1990 in WCW. Besides that, Tom Zink and Ryan Pillman are burning it up as a tag team. Ryan Pillman is now in WCW and other additions. We talked about him, and that's 1990 for you folks. So we end 1990 with Ric Flair as the WCW champion. Soon he'll be dropping it, believe me, and soon he'll be out of the WCW in 1991, and Hulk Hogan as the WWF champion. And to backtrack, what do we see? I mentioned Sergeant Slaughter and I mentioned the Iraq War. To backtrack, what do we see? Sergeant Slaughter coming out in the Brother Love, a special edition at SummerSlam of the Brother Love show. This is SummerSlam 1990, where he says the country is going soft. The country is now making peace with Russia, and he despises Russia. And now the American fans are cheering Nikolai Volkov now. He's sick of America, he says. And that would eventually lead him to turn heel and side with Saddam Hussein's Iraq, who we're still at war with by the time WrestleMania 7 comes around. So, it's not Hulk Hogan as WWF champion. It's the Ultimate Warrior as WWF champion. So Ultimate Warrior is still the WWF champion. Sting was the WCW champion, but loses it to Ric Flair. Ultimate Warrior will soon, at the Royal Rumble, when we get to 1991, we'll talk about it. He will soon lose the title to Sergeant Slaughter. So Sergeant Slaughter becomes the most hated man, not just in the WWF, but in the entire country, because he's siding with a country that we're actually at real war with in Iraq. He becomes the traitor of America, right? And Jesse Ventura, one of the things he does before he leaves the WWF, he suggests that as part of this Sergeant Slaughter storyline, that Sergeant Slaughter burned the American flag. Now, Sergeant Slaughter was still pretending to be a Marine at this time. It hadn't been uncovered that Bob Remus, Sergeant Slaughter's real name, was never a Marine, right? He never was in the United States Armed Forces ever. But we still thought he was, and he was going to burn the American flag. But he burns the Hulk Rules t-shirt after the match with him and Hogan is set up for WrestleMania 7. But we'll be talking about that next week, next time, in the next installment, we'll be talking about 1991. Peace, guys. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Hit the bell button to see my next videos coming out. Lisa, thank you for contributing. Love you guys. This is a long one. 1990 was a great year in professional wrestling. To me, it was not the peak of the golden era because that was last year, but it was a good year still for professional wrestling. Things wouldn't start to take a turn until the following year. And the following year was when things took a turn for the worst, in my opinion. 1991, the Sergeant Slaughter Iraqi storyline. We talked about it in the 1992 year in review video, but we'll talk more in depth about it and how I really felt about it and how this kind of thing never really worked out for WWE. And they tried it again in 2005 with Muhammad Hassan, but thanks to the 7-7 bombing in London that year, it never goes off. And they even tried it in AEW after October 7th. You know, they had MJF reference kind of obliquely anti-Semitism. And they figured, oh, it works for MJF because he's Jewish. Using geopolitics, like, okay, if it's years removed, like the Iron Sheik and Hulk Hogan, they had their match in '84. The Iran hostage crisis happened in '79, so it was already 5 years removed. But right in the thick of it, like right when it happens, it's never good, never good, never good. You know, it didn't work out for AEW when they did it last year. It didn't work out for WWE in 2005, and as we'll find out in the next installment, it didn't work out for them in 1991 either. Peace. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. America at war with Iraq, the first Persian Gulf War, the first American war in 15 years. And WWF's opinion and involvement in this is about to cost them dearly. And the 1992 election, 2 years after this, we thought for sure that because of his success in Iraq, stopping Saddam Hussein from invading the neighboring country of Kuwait, that George H.W. Bush would be the president going into the rest of the 1990s. As this is the beginning of the 1990s, and that's not the case. So we have a lot of fake fizzle. We have a lot of phonies. Not only is Sergeant Slaughter a phony in the WWF as a supporter of Saddam Hussein, with a guy who went to high school with Saddam Hussein, Sheikh Adnan Casey, right, aka Billy White Wolf, who was a fake Indian, and now he's teaming with a fake Iraqi. You also have other fakes. Last episode, we talked about the fake lip syncers, Milli Vanilli. You know, girl, you know it's true, but girl, you know what's not true? The rap career and the street credentials of both Vanilla Ice and MC Hammer. But MC Hammer had a little bit more street credentials than Vanilla Ice, right? But the street credentials of Vanilla Ice was completely fabricated. Who had a hit this year, 1990. Ice, baby, ding, 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 ding. He was sued by David Bowie and Queen. Good for his ass. And then he was later hung from a roof by one Suge Knight, which was Suge Knight's entry into the world of music, which would his music label that he founded, you know, 2 years later would dominate rap music and take rap music in another direction. And it was thanks to hanging Vanilla Ice from the roof, you know, that indirectly led to the founding of Death Row Records. Peace. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Also, another tie-in, Suge Knight was from Compton too, as he would say, as a member of the mob Pyrus, Bompton. Peace.